You feel the fabric of your glove tighten as your fingers dig into your skirt. The waiting room is too warm, the air thick with the scent of leather and carbolic acid. Your heart hammers against your corset stays, and you can't quite remember when breathing became something you had to think about instead of something that just happened. The gas lamp flickers overhead, casting shadows that seem to move with intention. You've been here before 3 times this month alone, but the shame never lessens. And the strangest part, the part you'll never speak aloud to anyone, is that you keep coming back. Mrs. Eleanor Ashford sits in that waiting room, her hands trembling slightly despite the oppressive London heat of 1889. She's 34 years old, married to a successful banker, mother of 2 children she rarely sees because nannies raise them. By every measure of Victorian respectability, her life is perfect. And yet she can barely sleep. She snaps at servants. Her chest tightens until she feels like she's drowning in air. 2 weeks ago at a dinner party, something happened to her body, a violent, convulsive sensation that left her flushed and gasping, requiring her husband to escort her out while guests whispered behind gloved hands. 3 doctors have examined her. All of them said the same word: hysteria. If you're watching this, drop a comment telling me where you are right now. I'm endlessly fascinated that a story this strange, this buried, can reach someone sitting thousands of miles away, more than a century later. Because what's about to happen in Dr. Robert Halloway's examination room isn't just medical malpractice. It's not even just about Victorian prudishness or outdated science. It's something far more extraordinary. An entire medical establishment giving millions of women orgasms for decades while maintaining with absolute sincerity that female sexuality didn't exist. They documented it in medical journals. They patented devices to make it more efficient. They charged fees, kept appointment books, built careers on it, and somehow, impossibly, absurdly, almost nobody recognized what they were actually doing. This is the story of how the most intimate act became the most clinical procedure, how pleasure was disguised as cure, and how an entire civilization conspired to not see what was happening right in front of them. The diagnosis of hysteria didn't begin with the Victorians. It stretched back more than 2,000 years to ancient Greece, where Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, looked at women suffering from anxiety, seizures, and inexplicable pain, and concluded their wombs were wandering. The Greek word oustera means uterus, and Hippocrates believed that when a woman remained unmarried, when her womb went unsatisfied, the organ would literally detach and travel through her body cavity, pressing against other organs, causing chaos. Plato went further, describing the uterus as an animal within an animal, possessed of its own desires, angry when denied its reproductive purpose. The cure seemed obvious: marriage, pregnancy, sexual intercourse, satisfy the womb, and the woman would be cured. By the Renaissance, physicians had begun to doubt the literal wandering womb. Dissections revealed ligaments holding the uterus in place. It couldn't actually travel. But here's the extraordinary part. They kept the diagnosis anyway. Hysteria simply evolved. If it wasn't a wandering organ causing the problem, it was something about female reproductive anatomy itself, some inherent instability, some fundamental weakness. The symptoms expanded to include almost anything: insomnia, irritability, shortness of breath, loss of appetite, muscle spasms, nervousness, sexual frigidity, sexual forwardness. A woman could be hysterical for wanting sex or for not wanting it, for being too emotional or too cold. The condition became infinitely elastic. By the time Eleanor Ashford sits in that waiting room in 1889, hysteria has become the second most common diagnosis, after fever itself. An estimated 75% of women will be diagnosed with it at some point in their lives. 75%. That's not a disease. That's the female experience being pathologized. Dr. Halloway enters the waiting room himself, not a nurse. He's 43, educated at Edinburgh, respected in London medical circles. His manner is brisk, professional, utterly confident. "Mrs. Ashford," he says, not unkindly, "please come through." The examination room is all mahogany and medical instruments arranged with geometric precision. There's a leather examination table in the center. A small side table holds bottles of oil that smell like lavender and roses. The walls are lined with anatomical charts, but notably, Eleanor notices none of them show female anatomy in any detail. Dr. Halloway gestures to a screen in the corner. "If you'll disrobe from the waist down and lie on the table, we'll begin your treatment." The condition responds quite well when caught early. Eleanor changes behind the screen, her fingers fumbling with buttons. Her mind keeps circling the same question. What exactly is he going to do? The previous doctors had prescribed rest, cold baths, tonics that tasted like rust. But Dr. Holloway had spoken with such certainty during her consultation, explaining how the female nervous system was delicate, how the uterus exerted profound influence over the entire body, how manual manipulation could induce a hysterical paroxysm that would provide immediate relief. She lies back on the leather table. It's cold, despite the summer heat. Dr. Holloway positions himself between her legs with the casual efficiency of someone performing a routine procedure. He doesn't ask permission. He doesn't explain what's about to happen. He simply begins applying scented oil with measured, deliberate movements. At first, it feels clinical, medicinal, but then his fingers begin to move with greater purpose, pressing deeper, finding points of sensitivity she didn't know existed. The sensation building within her is alarming, overwhelming in its intensity. Her breathing becomes shallow. Her muscles begin to contract involuntarily. She wants to speak, to object, but no words come because Dr. Holloway's expression is one of pure professional concentration, utterly devoid of anything improper. And then suddenly, violently release. Her back arches off the table. Her hands grasp the leather edges. For a moment, everything dissolves into sensation, into an explosion of pressure and relief, and something so foreign to her lived experience that she couldn't name it if her life depended on it. Dr. Holloway steps back, already writing notes on his clipboard. "Excellent," he says, as casually as if he'd checked her reflexes. "The paroxysm was quite pronounced. You should see immediate relief from your symptoms. I'd like to see you again Thursday, twice weekly, for the next month would be optimal." Eleanor dresses in silence, her mind reeling. What just happened? And why does she already know she returned for her Thursday appointment? What Dr. Holloway has just performed is called pelvic massage, and by 1889 it's become one of the most common procedures in Western medicine. Medical textbooks describe it in exhaustive detail. Physicians present papers about optimal techniques at medical conferences. The procedure is taught in medical schools, and every single description, every clinical paper, every textbook entry manages to document what's happening without ever using the word that would make it obvious. Because Victorian medical education has performed an extraordinary act of erasure. Medical students learn male anatomy in excruciating detail, every vessel, every nerve, every functional structure. But female anatomy is taught in vague generalities. The clitoris is barely mentioned in textbooks. When it appears at all, it's labeled vestigial, or described with such deliberate vagueness that graduating physicians literally don't know it has any functional purpose. Some anatomy texts omit it entirely. He's describing orgasm. He has no idea he's describing orgasm. Dr. Russell Trail, writing in 1903, complains bitterly about the procedure's demands. Achieving hysterical paroxysm can require up to an hour and a half of continuous manipulation. The physical demand placed upon the physician is considerable. It is among the most tedious and exhausting medical procedures. He's complaining about how tiring it is to manually stimulate women to orgasm, and he genuinely doesn't understand that's what he's complaining about. The scale becomes staggering. By the 1890s, certain physicians in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia specialize exclusively in hysteria treatment. Dr. Samuel Taylor's practice advertises complete relief from nervous exhaustion and female troubles and employs for physicians to handle patient volume. Appointment books from surviving practices show the same women returning weekly, sometimes for years, every Thursday at 2 o'clock. Same patient, same treatment. For a decade, wealthy women can afford house calls. But the most fashionable option is the hydrotherapy resort. European spas advertise water-based hysteria treatments, powerful jets of pressurized water directed at patients' genitals while they sit in specially designed chairs. Bath in England becomes famous for it. Baden-Baden in Germany markets itself as a center for female nervous restoration. Women travel across Europe to spend weeks at these establishments, receiving multiple treatments daily. The advertisements promise complete restoration of feminine vitality through scientific application of thermal waters. One woman writes in her diary in 1892, "My weekly appointments with Dr. Harrison have quite restored my spirits. I find myself looking forward to Thursday afternoons with great anticipation, though I couldn't explain to anyone why. Of course, she feels restored. She's receiving regular orgasms in a society where sexual pleasure for women is supposed to be impossible. The women know they can't articulate it in the language of sexuality. That language doesn't exist for respectable women, but they know. They recommend their physicians to friends. They maintain appointments for years. They request specific doctors. They express disappointment when their regular practitioner is unavailable. The demand isn't coming from physicians pushing treatment. The patients are actively seeking it out, scheduling around it, prioritizing it. But the physicians have no idea at all. Then, in 1883, something changes. Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville, a London physician, develops a problem. His hands are giving out. Years of performing pelvic massage have caused severe inflammation in his wrists and fingers. So he does what any clever Victorian engineer would do. He mechanizes it. He creates a device called the percutor, powered by an electromagnetic engine, capable of producing rapid vibrations at adjustable speeds. It can achieve in 10 minutes what previously required an hour of manual labor. Granville insists publicly that his invention is meant for treating male muscle disorders. But physicians working with female patients immediately recognize its application. Within 2 decades, vibrators become the 5th most common electrical appliance in American homes. More widespread than electric irons or vacuum cleaners, the 1908 Sears catalog advertises a home vibrator as very useful and satisfactory for home service, displayed right next to sewing machines and toasters. Women's magazines run advertisements showing women using vibrators on their faces, their necks, their arms, with text proclaiming, "Vibration is life. The secret of the ages has been discovered." These aren't euphemisms. These are actual mainstream advertisements for devices being sold to produce orgasms. And somehow everyone involved maintains the fiction that they're for general health and vitality. The Chattanooga vibrator promises hysteria relief in under 10 minutes. The White Cross electric vibrator advertises the essence of life delivered to your door. 1910 AD shows a smiling woman with text reading, "Such delightful companions." Every woman appreciates the value of this penetrating, invigorating massage. The double meaning seems so obvious now, but at the time, nobody acknowledged it. Or more precisely, the women understood at some level, and the men selling the devices understood, but the medical establishment and respectable society maintained absolute denial. Then, in the 1920s, the illusion shatters. The moment vibrators appear in pornography, they become impossible to rationalize as medical devices. The association is instant and total. Within 5 years, vibrators essentially vanish from medical practice. Sears drops them from the catalog by 1925, not gradually, but seemingly overnight. Medical journals stop mentioning them. Physicians quietly dispose of the devices sitting in their examination rooms. The treatment that had been standard medical practice, documented in journals, taught in schools, performed on millions of women, becomes taboo almost instantly. What changed? Not the device, not its function, only the cultural context. Once the sexual nature became undeniable, the entire medical edifice supporting it collapsed. Hysteria as a formal diagnosis lingered until 1952, when it was finally removed from psychiatric manuals. But the underlying assumption that women's complaints are emotional rather than physical, neurotic rather than real, persisted. The specific diagnosis disappeared, but the dismissal remained. It wasn't until the 1960s, when researchers William Masters and Virginia Johnson conducted the first rigorous scientific studies of human sexual response, that female sexuality was finally documented properly. And what did they find? Exactly what Victorian physicians had been observing for decades. The hysterical paroxysm was simply an orgasm. The muscular contractions, the flushing, the breathing, the release, all of it was textbook sexual response. The physicians had been right there, performing the act thousands of times, documenting every physiological detail, and they never recognized it. Not because the information didn't exist, not because they were stupid, but because their entire education, their professional culture, their society had constructed an elaborate framework of denial around female sexuality that was so complete, so systematic, that highly educated men could give women orgasms for their entire careers and never once acknowledge what they were doing. Think about what had to be true for this to work. Medical schools had to omit crucial anatomical information. Professional journals had to publish papers describing orgasm without using the word. Examination rooms had to be architecturally designed to maintain denial the covered face. The clinical positioning, everything engineered to let both parties pretend this wasn't happening, and every single participant had to maintain the performance. The physicians treating it as medicine, the patients experiencing it but unable to name it. Society accepting it as legitimate while simultaneously insisting female sexuality didn't exist. It was perhaps history's most elaborate conspiracy of silence. Except everyone involved actually believed what they were saying. The treatment ended not because physicians suddenly understood, but because pornography made denial impossible. The same culture that had spent centuries insisting women had no sexual desires was confronted with images that couldn't be rationalized away. And rather than acknowledge what they'd been doing all along, rather than admit the obvious, the medical establishment simply stopped. Overnight, without explanation, without apology. The women who had structured their lives around these appointments, who had found relief in them, who had experienced perhaps the only sexual satisfaction of their entire lives, they were left without explanation. The treatment simply ended. The physicians moved on. The cultural amnesia was nearly total. Some women wrote about it later, though necessarily in guarded language. Others never spoke of it, carrying the memory as private knowledge of something the world insisted wasn't real. Patient testimonials exist in archives, hidden in old diaries. Coded in the careful language women learned from their doctors. They hint at understanding without quite saying it. They describe anticipation, relief, restoration. They recommend physicians to friends. They document years of appointments. And beneath the medical terminology, you can read what they couldn't write. I knew. I always knew. There's a museum in London that has a small exhibit of Victorian medical devices. In a glass case, there's a Chattanooga vibrator from 1905, its metal gleaming under museum lights. The placard describes it neutrally, used for treatment of female hysteria, 1880s, 1920s. Visitors take photographs. Sometimes they laugh uncomfortably, unsure whether the implications they're seeing are real or whether they're misinterpreting history. They're not misinterpreting. What the placard doesn't say is that this device, and thousands like it, were used to give millions of women orgasms, while an entire civilization maintained they were incapable of sexual pleasure. That brilliant, educated physicians operated them daily without understanding their purpose. That women experienced relief they couldn't name. That the whole system functioned on collective blindness so profound it lasted generations. The device sits there in its case, inert now, no longer plugged in, no longer humming with electromagnetic purpose, but it remembers. And so should we. Because somewhere right now, in modern medical practice, there are almost certainly equivalent blindnesses. Things happening regularly, discussed in professional literature, performed by educated practitioners that future generations will look back on with the same bewilderment we feel looking at that vibrator in its glass case. We can't see them. That's the nature of cultural blindness. But they're there.